So today we're making a transition in the book of Ezekiel. We've been talking about this larger section that began in chapter 25, the judgment on the nations. And as you recall, it started in Ammon and worked its way clockwise around Israel, lingered on Tyre. And now in this new section, which begins today in chapter 29 and goes through chapter 32, we're going to be lingering on Egypt. So I've labeled this chapter Egypt's Future. So there's an interesting and complicated relationship between Israel and Egypt throughout the Bible. Egypt was the place where Jacob sought refuge during a famine, and Egypt welcomed them and gave them an area of their own and kept them separate. But Egypt then became a place of slavery for them, a place of servitude, a place that they had to be liberated from by God's mighty hand. Israel's king in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 17, was warned not to go back to Egypt for help. Don't go back to Egypt to try to stockpile horses for your military, is what they're told in Deuteronomy 17. Don't look to Egypt for help. Yet, Israel, particularly Judah, sought a security agreement with Egypt against Babylon. They wanted to have an ally to help defend against the rising power of Babylon, and that agreement really ended in disaster. That's what we'll see here in just a moment. That's the historical setting of this chapter. But it ended in disaster. After the fall of Judah and Jerusalem, a remnant of Judah, a remnant of Jerusalem fled from Israel into Egypt for protection. But Egypt couldn't protect them. They were subject to Nebuchadnezzar's invasion themselves, and the remnant fell into idolatry while they were in Egypt. We saw that in the book of Jeremiah. So, but then when we come to the New Testament, we see Jesus's family, and Herod is trying to kill Jesus. And what do? They flee into Egypt. So there's this tension, this interesting, complicated relationship between God's people in Egypt. Warned against them, warned not to depend on Egypt, yet they flee to Egypt for help. They look to Egypt and they're disappointed, but Egypt seems to be there as a refuge for them. So that's just some background here. That would be a different study, I guess, to unravel all that. But want to highlight that he is now turning to address Egypt and their future. And in this chapter, we're going to see three things. We're going to see Egypt's destruction in verses 1 through 12, their restoration in verses 13 through 16, and then the invasion in verses 17 through 21. And again, this is only the first of more than three chapters, 29, 30, 31, and 32, that are going to talk about Egypt. So we open up in verse 1, the 10th year of the 10th month, on the 12th of the month, the word of the Lord came to me. Ezekiel's great. You know, he gives us these date markers throughout the book. I think there's 12 or 14 of these sorts of things here. So what we see that this is January 7th, 587. We can nail this in the calendar. And the Lord directs Ezekiel to prophesy of the coming judgment of Egypt. Now, what's going on today, or what's going on in that day, is the siege of Jerusalem is in full swing. Now, Egypt had promised to defend Israel or help defend Israel, but when Nebuchadnezzar showed up and began to lay siege, Egypt fled. So God is going to bring this judgment in light of their fleeing. He's going to bring judgment on Egypt in light of the fact that they've reneged on their agreement. They went back on their covenant and left Israel basically out to dry. So the siege of Jerusalem is in full swing. It's another year before the fall of the city, but that's the setting here. Verse 3, take a look at that. Speak to them, speak and say, thus says the Lord, behold, I am against you, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, the great monster that lies in the midst of his rivers, that has said, my Nile is mine, and I myself have made it. So again, we see this kind of pride in the Pharaoh of Egypt that we saw in the leader of Tyre. He's taking credit for creating the Nile, essentially, as ridiculous as that sounds. Who is this Pharaoh? Well, history tells us that it's Pharaoh named Hophra. Jeremiah 37 and 44 tell us that Zedekiah looked to this very Pharaoh for help against Nebuchadnezzar. And this Pharaoh who built himself up as if he were the founder and the creator of the Nile turned and fled when Nebuchadnezzar showed up. He's the grandson, incidentally, of Necho II. Necho II was defeated, or he defeated and killed the last godly king in Judah, Josiah, at the Battle of Megiddo in 609. And he was in turn defeated by Nebuchadnezzar in 605 at Carchemish. So this was at the point where Nebuchadnezzar's power, the power of Babylon, was rising. Egypt's power was on the wane. So let's come to the history behind this. He's going to use this metaphor of a fish to describe the punishment that's going to be brought on this arrogant king and the nation of Israel, or Egypt. So be alert for that. He's using a metaphor again. It's vivid, it's memorable. And again, Egypt, situated along the Nile, situated on the entrance to the south coast of the Mediterranean Sea, was a fishing economy, so they would have resonated with this metaphor. Verses 6 and 7, the metaphor shifts from being like a fish to being a weak walking cane, a weak walking staff, so that Egypt is depicted as this unreliable ally. You know, my wife and I, Sherry, we'll go up into Rocky Mountain National Park and go hiking. We went hiking just a few weeks ago, like a 13-mile hike. We've got these trekking poles, and I often use these trekking poles, which are telescoping, on my descent. The ascent into the park usually can handle that pretty well, but I need some additional stability coming down and navigating the rocks. Once in a while, my trekking pole won't be tight and it'll collapse under me and I'll go tumbling. That's what's pictured here. They're kind of a weak walking staff. You put weight on them, they collapse and they go tumbling, and that's what's happened here. In verse 11, we see this prediction of the destruction that just like captives are taken from Jerusalem and Judea, captives are going to be taken into exile by Nebuchadnezzar. This was kind of his policy with conquered people, is that he would take some of the population back to Babylon. You can almost think of them there as hostages. So that's what's going to happen to the Egyptian captives. They're going to go into captivity for 40 years. Nebuchadnezzar has about that time left before the rise of the Persian Empire. And the Persians have a different philosophy on captive people. They settle them in their own land and help them there. So when the Persians replace the Babylonians in about 40 years, the Egyptians are going to return to their own land. So verses 1 through 12 is about the destruction. Verses 1 through 13 through 16 is about the restoration of Egypt. So Egypt's going to return after 40 years, their new kingdom. It's not going to be anything like the former glory of Egypt. It's going to be much reduced. Israel is never again in verse 16, going to rely on the power of Egypt for protection. They're never going to do that again, and they haven't. Verses 17 through 21, again, are a marker here of this invasion that's coming. Verse 17, now in the 27th year, in the first month, the word of the Lord came to me. Verse 18, Son of man, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, made his army labor hard against Tyre. Every head was made bald, and every shoulder was rubbed bare. But he and his army had no wages from Tyre for the labor that he had performed against it. Therefore, thus says the Lord God, behold, I will give the land of Egypt to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. So we've got another one of these time markers in verse 17. This puts us in April of 571. So quite a bit of time has passed since the beginning of chapter 29. Nebuchadnezzar himself has laid siege to Tyre from 585, so just after the fall of Jerusalem, to 572. So that siege is now coming to an end. And you can imagine a 13-year siege like that is very expensive. And the collapse of Tyre, as wealthy as it was, did little to defray the cost of that 13-year effort. So God is going to provide the wealth of Egypt. Notice again here, God's sovereignty. He decides the disposition of nations and their wealth. It's all his. It all belongs to him, and he decides what's going to happen to it. And he decides here that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Egypt, is going to benefit from the wealth of Israel or Egypt, and that he is going to be reimbursed, as we might say, for the effort that he expended to bring down Tyre and fulfill those prophecies. On that day, verse 21 says, I will make a horn sprout for the house of Israel. Again, we have another messianic prophecy that ends the chapter. It's as if God is saying, I'm going to destroy these nations, I'm going to reduce them, I'm going to humble them, but ultimately I'm lifting up my people. This horn is a symbol of power, so this is a prophecy that power is going to return to the house of Israel, and that power is going to be in the person of the Messiah. He's going to be put into that position, and I will open your mouth in their midst. Then they will know that I am the Lord. So he could be talking about here, open the mouth of the Messiah, and they will know that he is the Lord, that when they hear him reign and rule. It could be, though, and I think probably what's in view here is he's going to open Nebuchadnezzar's, or not Nebuchadnezzar, but Ezekiel's mouth. And we're going to see that later in this, that when a messenger comes from Judah to Babylon, where, recall, Ezekiel is, and tells them of the fall of Jerusalem and Judea, then Ezekiel's mouth is going to be open to speak. I think is what's the idea here. Is no longer going to be silent. It's going to be speaking about Israel's future glory. And that begins in chapter 33, verse 22, when a messenger comes from Egypt or Israel with message of the destruction of the temple. So there we have the chapter 29. How we apply this to ourselves, if we reflect on this, and I've kind of alluded to this, really throughout the major prophets, we're reminded over and over and over again that history is just not a series of random events. History is not driven by the decision of kings and generals. History is driven by God. God is determining what is happening in the world all the time. As Paul tells the Athenians in Acts chapter 17, that the God that they don't know is the God that created all men, that establishes his borders, raises up nations, and brings them down, which is exactly what we see happening today. God is the ultimate power, brothers and sisters, that's directing human history. It was true in 571 BC. It's true in 2022 AD. Be sure God's at work. God bless you, brothers and sisters.